Live from Washington, D.C., this is Balance of Power with Joe Mathieu and Kailey Leinz.
It's Economic D-Day for Iran. But what about Canada? Welcome to the Monday edition as the Trump administration turns the economic screws on both countries. Sanctions for Iran, tariffs for Canada. And we're about to learn a lot more. I'm Joe Mathieu alongside Kailey Leinz in Washington. Kailey, the markets are listening as the Treasury Secretary is about to hold forth here in Washington.
Yep, holding a news conference as they outline what exactly Economic D-Day will entail. Of course, the Treasury Secretary gave us a bit of a preview in the form of an op-ed in the Financial Times over the weekend, which he was likening this effort from the administration as akin to that taken in World War II by FDR and Winston Churchill. But what we expect him to say is that it's a crackdown on other countries who provide financial and economic lifeline to Iran, not just about Iran itself.
That's true. And of course, Canada is very much in the mix today with what appears to be dollar for dollar reciprocal tariffs now coming back, counter tariffs from Canada, with the president saying a lot about the auto sector, additional tariffs that would take effect, I guess, in 2027. It's a little bit confusing when we get to this, but we're curious about not what only happens on D-Day, but what happens on D+1 and D+2, and whether these policies will have an impact. We're going to talk to economist Joe Lavorgna about that coming up.
Yeah, it's going to be a fascinating conversation as we consider for Canada, which already now has in place the Section 338 tariffs of 50% on billions of dollars of goods, which went into effect on Friday after these talks collapsed. Canada's retaliatory tariffs on $20 billion worth of goods, dollar for dollar, goes into effect September 8th. To your point, the escalation that the president outlined with 50% tariffs on auto, steel, etc. in his True Social post wouldn't be until January 1st. So is there some wiggle room for negotiation in between each of these dates? Our colleague Josh Wingo's reporting would indicate no, Canada's expecting this trade war will be one that's the long haul.
That's true, beyond the midterms. Yet J.D. Vance just said in Maine that negotiations are ongoing. So we're getting more confused. Maybe the Treasury Secretary will address this as well coming up.
Yes, and of course, when he starts speaking, we'll bring it to you live here on Bloomberg TV and radio. But first, let's get a baseline of where the markets are trading ahead of his remarks as we turn to Charlie Pellet at the New York. Hey, Charlie.
Well, hello there, and here's what's going on. We do have the Dow Jones Industrial Average trading lower right now. Certainly, investors watching all of these developments involving trade, the Middle East, and of course, later in the week when we get NVIDIA earnings, also Kevin Warsh on Friday. But right now, we got the S&P trading lower by 15, drop there of 0.2%. As I mentioned, the Dow higher, up 0.2%. NASDAQ Composite down 0.4. NASDAQ 100 down 0.7%. 2-year currently yielding 4.23% with the 10-year 4.69%, the 30-year 5.21%. Spot gold up 0.9%, 46.45 the ounce, while West Texas Intermediate crude major move to the downside. WTI just above 85 a barrel, down by 2.4%. Barrel of Brent, the global benchmark, 92.30, drop there of 2.2%. Big move for Bitcoin, 78,620 right now. Bitcoin up by about 1.6%. Oil did fall below $85 a barrel. The market waiting to see the U.S. economic isolation plan for Iran. We'll have a whole lot more for you coming up right here on Bloomberg Balance of Power. Oil super majors are trading lower. ExxonMobil down 1.5%. Chevron right now down 1.2%. ConocoPhillips down 1.1%. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie Pellet, thank you very much. And here on Bloomberg TV and radio, we're going to take you now live to the U.S. Treasury, where Secretary Scott Bessent is making the announcement on this so-called Economic D-Day for Iran. Let's listen.
Around the globe, our objective is to sever every economic lifeline that sustains this tyrannical regime until Tehran stands alone. Iran's fanatics devote themselves to death to America and seek nuclear weapons to do just that. They have murdered and maimed more of our citizens and service members than any other terrorist regime on earth. And they have been against America, their neighbors in the Gulf, and much of the world for 47 years. President Trump has taken action that his predecessors have long deferred. And under his leadership, America is no longer managing the Iranian threat. We are ending it. Our great armed forces have laid the groundwork for achieving the president's objective of preventing Iran from ever obtaining nuclear weapons. They have shown America's resolve to finally end this threat. And the strength of America's economy under President Trump allows us to wage this sustained financial operation alongside the might of our military. Iran now faces a very clear choice with only two paths before them: complete global isolation and a subsistence economy, or a path back to normalcy with an opportunity to rejoin the global economy. Today, we are launching Operation Economic Outcast to foreclose every other option available to the Iranian regime. Treasury has mapped every node, every facilitator, and every network that Iran has used to smuggle oil and evade sanctions. Beginning today, the actions of Treasury and other agencies will tighten the noose and block every potential source of revenue that funds the IRGC and the evil Iranian regime. We are enforcing a zero leakage approach. There will be no minimal breathing space for the regime to rebuild its capacity to inflict terror against America and the world. The final refuge of this regime is the mistaken conclusion of nations that still finance the Iranian threat in the hopes of evading it. It is no longer acceptable to operate in the gray spaces of this conflict. Countries cannot claim they are blind to enabling this activity. Iran's enablers purchase, transport its petroleum. They facilitate the flow of its finances through exchange houses and free trade zones. They welcome Iran's flights and maintain registries on its behalf. They turn a blind eye to seaborne fuel transfers and overland transits. They condone illicit use of their banks, all the while concealing the extent of their complicity. The president is making phone calls to world leaders with specific requests to cease their interactions with the regime. We are already seeing results. Over the weekend, comments from Iranian leadership clearly acknowledged the effect of this campaign, and nations that facilitate any interactions with the regime should quickly heed our message. Those who stand with the United States will reap the rewards of our partnership. Those who tether themselves to the Iranian regime should expect to share in the isolation of a withering regime. Teams from Treasury, State, and the U.S. military are now meeting with their global counterparts to tell them that the United States expects action. Every country has a defined timeline to shut down activities we have identified. If they do not take action, we will do so unilaterally through Treasury authorities. For example, every branch of Bank Melay must be shuttered and dark. And let me be clear, any entity that facilitates money laundering on behalf of Iran will be removed from the US dollar system. The clock just started ticking. The new sectoral sanctions determinations issued today target 5 of Iran's most vital lifelines that it exploits in other countries: digital assets, technology, gold, aviation, and shipping. These measures broaden secondary sanctions risk for anyone foolish enough to continue conducting business with this regime, and will accelerate the speed with which we pursue them. As I speak, Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control is also sanctioning over 60 entities, individuals, and vessels around the world that enable the Iranian regime to procure illicit nuclear and missile technology, conduct cyber operations, and generate oil revenue. This is a sustained campaign to collapse every last option for Iran. Let there be no ambiguity as to the position of the United States. An economic engagement of any kind with this murderous regime will expose those responsible to the full reach of American power. For decades, this regime has drawn strength from a calculus that regards Iranian retaliation as certain and American enforcement as negotiable. Under President Trump, that era is over. To the ordinary soldiers supporting this regime, As more and more of your paychecks stop or are supposedly just delayed, ask whether your commanders are leading your country to triumph or to ruin. And recall that the Berlin Wall fell when ordinary soldiers decided not to shoot at their own people. And to those who enable Tehran, do not discount the cost of testing Washington's resolve. No nation should expect to enjoy the rewards of our system while helping those who seek to destroy it. It is now a time for world leaders to make a decision between prosperity and isolation, peace and terror, America and Iran. The campaign we begin today will gather force with every day that follows, and it will not end until this regime stands alone. With that, I welcome your questions. David from Reuters.
Hi, thanks, Secretary. One of the most powerful tools you have at your disposal is the ability to impose secondary sanctions on banks and financial institutions that facilitate transactions for Iran. Chinese banks have often been talked about being targeted, but we don't see any of those institutions targeted here. Is that something that is coming in this campaign, or is the very delicate trade truce with China something that could prohibit you from going that far and taking that very big step?
We want to make clear here today that no one is above the reach of U.S. sanctions. That if they facilitate transactions and are part of the ecosystem that turns Iranian oil into money, into repression, they will be targeted. We find that the best way to engage with countries is through quiet diplomacy, and we are level setting with every country to tell them our expectations. We know who they are, they know who they are, so when the hammer of U.S. Treasury actions falls upon them, they will have no one to blame but themselves. So, Richard from CBS.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. You said the president is calling world leaders with specific asks and that there is a defined timeline. Who is he calling and what are the asks?
We're not going to name names. That we've already seen some results, and that I am confident the president, as you all know, is quite persuasive, and we are following his calls up with calls from visits and calls from the State Department and from the U.S. Treasury, expecting them, or telling the leaders, the countries, and the entities exactly what we expect and the timelines. And I would expect that very quickly, if they do not respond, then you will see the ramifications of their actions.
Can you say how far the timelines are?
Again, I'm not going to set timelines, but we do not have infinite patience here. Jennifer?
Thank you so much, Mr. Secretary. Jennifer Schonberger with Yahoo Finance. You just said moments ago that no one is above U.S. sanctions. What specific secondary sanctions or penalties is Treasury prepared to levy against Chinese banks and shipping firms if they do not comply? And then secondly, as you look to take these unprecedented sanctions, you've also said that as the Iran conflict fades and oil prices recede, that will help bring down long-term bond yields. In the meantime, you have mentioned your toolkit, and I'm curious if you are looking at reducing auction sizes for longer-term dated Treasury debt going forward, and what other actions you may consider from that toolkit.
Yeah, well, why don't we work backwards? We issued the quarterly refunding announcement 2.5 weeks ago. We are going to continue with our regular program of auctions, so you will be hearing from us again at the beginning of next quarter. In terms of, as I said, every country, every entity should know that they should be prepared to face U.S. sanctions. And no one is above this. We are going to hold everyone accountable, and this is economic asphyxiation of this regime. And Jennifer, as I said, no one should test our resolve. So, Josh from New York Post.
You said you weren't going to name names, but there's been some reports that the United Arab Emirates is among some of the first nations to take seriously these words from the United States to cut off all business interactions with Iran. Is UAE leading the way in this respect?
I would think that the actions that they took last week were not coincident, but likely causal. And I would expect that we would see a broad array of countries taking similar actions as we continue our engagement. The UAE have been very good partners and have taken the brunt of the Iranian attacks in the Gulf. And what have these countries gotten over the years from appeasing Iran? They were subject to violent attacks. While we were bombing Iran, they were bombing them. So it shows that with this regime, appeasement does not work. And on the other side, with this regime, trying to buy appeasement will no longer work in the eyes of the United States of America. And I want to emphasize that we are spreading out across the world as we speak, that you will see a wave of sanctions when you leave this meeting today, and you should expect that cadence to continue. And I would expect that you will see a major announcement of a financial institution being sanctioned by the end of this week. So, Samira from Sky. Yep. No. No. Are you? No. I'm looking for Samira from Sky. No. Hi.
Does the United States and President Trump still want Canada to become a state? He did say that they're getting all the benefits of being a state without being one.
I think he would like Canada to come to the table and negotiate in good faith. They were offered quite a good deal last week. They chose to reject it. Unfortunately, Prime Minister Carney rose to power on an anti-American, anti-Trump platform. I believe he was more than 20 points behind, and he seems to have gone back to his old playbook. And I think one has to ask oneself, is he trying to benefit himself, the Liberal Party, or the Canadian people? Because they were offered a very good job. So, yep, you.
Thank you, Secretary Bessent. If I could shift to bond yields quickly. We saw them tick down today after some turbulence and going up last week. Can you tell us if there's any possibility that there will be more bond buybacks anytime soon?
Again, we haven't bought a single bond yet. The next time we have an operation is September 9th. So we will see on September 9th. All right. One more. Let's see. You in the front.
You described this as an economic D-Day, but D-Day wasn't a threat of an invasion, and the U.S. didn't give a timeline to Germany. So why not impose the sanctions today?
Well, we are giving everyone the opportunity to remedy bad behavior. Why would I want to blow up the global financial system? We believe that it is important to level set and give people a cure period, but they should know that that will move very quickly and that we are serious. Secondary sanctions are a very powerful tool, and we here at Treasury, this is Jeanne Lang, the acting Undersecretary for Terrorism Finance, and in the Terrorism Finance Department and at OFAC, the reason we are able to use secondary sanctions is because we do not take their use lightly. So we believe that a warning shot and a level set of expectations is appropriate. And if people do not want to meet our expectations, then we expect, and they should expect, that they will leave the dollar system. Okay, thank you all.
There you have it, with the Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent speaking live in Washington and taking a couple of questions from reporters, now making his way off the stage. That was live at the Treasury Department. I'm Joe Mathieu alongside Kailey Leinz here in Washington with a ream of headlines on the terminal. This was, of course, forecast to be about what he calls economic D-Day for Iran. And Kailey, the Treasury Secretary, is saying that the U.S. will block every potential revenue source for the IRGC, and that could be many here. We got a couple of red headlines as well, saying that the U.S. will end dollar access to those laundering Iranian money. And just toward the end there, a major financial institution to be sanctioned this week. So in the next couple of days, we're going to have a lot more headlines on this with, of course, China in focus. He did take questions suggesting that China would not be spared.
No, even though China isn't initially targeted, at least in this round, he did speak to this notion that none of this is intended to be immediate, that he wants to level set and give entities and countries that are engaged in this facilitation of economic lifeline providing to Iran, frankly, laundering money, etc., some time to correct their behavior. He said specifically that he wouldn't say the timelines, but that Treasury does not have infinite patience here. So obviously meant to be a warning shot, as the Treasury Secretary described, to all of these countries. Let's get more on this now as we turn to Bloomberg Washington correspondent Tyler Kendall, who is live at the White House for us. So Tyler, I guess this is what the economic D-Day plan is, though we still are awaiting exact details and battle plans, if you will.
Exactly, Kailey. At this point, it is very clear that the White House is trying to ramp up the economic pressure in a bid to get Iran to the negotiating table, perhaps using this as leverage in order to try to get some sort of movement amid what really has been stalled talks. As you and Joe just hit those red headlines there, the Treasury Secretary saying that the U.S. will end dollar access to those laundering Iranian money. He said that this is going to equate to broadening out the secondary sanctions risk for those countries that continue to do business with Iran. He also mentioned that the Treasury Department is sanctioning 60 different entities and individuals as we speak. In response to the question on China, though, the Secretary did not rule that out. He said that, quote, no one is above the reach of this, but also added that quiet diplomacy is taking place, which was really interesting to hear him talk about. The idea that President Trump is currently placing calls, as well as calls being placed to counterparts from the Treasury Department, the State Department, and the U.S. military, reaching out, as he said, across the globe to try to get these countries to limit these financial lifelines. But importantly, no defined timeline to, quote, shut down these activities that we've identified, going on to say that it's related to digital assets, technology, gold, aviation, and shipping. The Secretary ended by saying, quote, it is no longer acceptable to operate in the gray areas of this conflict. But Kailey, as you just outlined there, still big questions on exactly the timeline that these different countries have. We know the UAE, for example, already moved to cut financial ties with Iran, but we're still waiting for updates from some of those other countries beyond China. We're thinking about Turkey and India as just two other examples.
Well, Tyler, before we go to Joe Lavorgna, we're thinking about Canada as well. And the Treasury Secretary was asked about the economic statecraft that we're witnessing between the two. And some are even calling it a trade war right now. He said Canada was offered a very good deal. Trump wants Canada to come to the table to negotiate. Of course, we're seeing headlines from J.D. Vance as well in Brewer, Maine, who said negotiations are still underway. Tyler, do we know anything about the current state of affairs here? Josh Wingrove's reporting would suggest that this was completely fallen apart.
Right. Sort of two sides to this. Both sides had been projecting optimism. Then both sides were blaming each other for these talks ultimately falling apart. Our own reporting, as you're mentioning, saying that Canada does not feel that these talks are going to resume until after the midterms, but did also leave some room there, cautioning that this all remains very fluid. And as we continue to see the escalation of tit-for-tat retaliation, perhaps that is also adding to the pressure here, because the 50% tariffs that have gone into effect on $20 billion worth of goods is a rather significant move, especially considering that we had heard that we were on the brink of a trade deal happening. Joe, as you know, one of those key items really did come down to the auto tariffs. President Trump ramping up that threat for autos 50% by January 1st if something isn't reached. But I will point out, we heard from the Canadian side of things that it was the U.S., according to them, that didn't want to extend those lower rates down to all vehicles such as trucks. And that's one of the reasons we ultimately saw this upended.
Wow, Tyler, a lot to go through here, and we appreciate all of your reporting today. Tyler Kendall, Washington correspondent, live at the White House. I mentioned Joe Lavorgna was coming up, and what a day to have him with us. The chief economist, SMBC America's former counselor to Treasury Scott Bessent, who we just heard from, and an important economic advisor to President Trump in the first term. He's with us live from World Headquarters in New York. Joe, good to see you.
Good to see you.
Welcome. You've been very generous with your time, and everyone should know you were listening along with all of us as the Treasury Secretary spoke. Will D-Day work this time?
The sanctions, though, as Kailey said, we need more details, but it seems very strict and potentially very groundbreaking and broad in a way that sanctions have not been used before. The fact that the U.S. is trying to pressure Iran to the negotiating table, to me, is a positive. We're not involved in military kinetics at the moment. Hopefully that will remain the case, and that somehow there is a negotiation that takes place. But, of course, if the sanctions work the way the administration would like them, and the regime crumbles internally because of it, well, that will also be effective. So it's a strong negotiating tactic. We'll see what happens. I don't know exactly how they're going to be implemented, but right now, from what I heard, it sounds like the rhetoric is pretty harsh, and my guess is, Joe, it will be matched with action.
Do you expect that it will be matched with action equally for all of these different countries to which it could apply? He obviously indicated that China wouldn't be exempt from this, Joe, but I do wonder if you believe that the U.S. would really be willing to do its worst ahead of Xi Jinping's visit here just weeks from now.
Right. Well, that's a fair point. And there was one of the questions that asked about the comparison to D-Day, and the Secretary is, allowing there to be some runway before these are fully implemented so that these backdoor, whatever it was, negotiations, so to speak, backdoor, I think was the word used, or back channel, negotiations proceed so that there could be some success. So the Secretary is pretty persuasive. He knows how this negotiation process works, which is why I believe intentionally he didn't want to give that much information. The fact that he did allude to the fact that major financial institution could be sanctioned this week, I think is important and probably is raising some eyebrows. So we'll just have to wait and see. But I think he was, as I said, very firm, very credible. We'll just have to see now what actually happens.
It was mentioned earlier, Joe, that as of right now, Scott Bessent is running the war with Iran much more than Pete Hegseth is. And as the administration turns from military warcraft to economic statecraft, I'm just wondering your thoughts on this. You worked very closely with him. Is this something that he envisioned? Did you game this out when you were at the Treasury? And is the country in better hands now that he's in charge of this? Well,
obviously, I'm very happy. Having worked for the Secretary, I'm very happy he's in that position. And I can tell you many clients, it's like the Bloomberg story that was run a number of months ago in Bessent We Trust. I wouldn't say that the Treasury Secretary is taking over from the Secretary of War. The fact is, and when you were in Treasury, you realize it, but the tentacles, the reach of Treasury is just so broad and deep. Undersecretary for Terrorism and Financial Intelligence, Acting Secretary Jeanne, the sanctions are a big part of the Treasury's portfolio. So the fact that the administration is using economic leverage in addition to prior military kinetics are all part of a larger platform. But I wouldn't say, one department is overtaking another. This is just part of the Treasury's portfolio, which has certainly grown in scope relative to, past Treasury secretaries, and I think it reflects the fact that President and many in the administration have a lot of faith and confidence in the Treasury secretaries. Hopefully, they'll be successful.
Well, when we consider the various challenges the Treasury Secretary now has before him, certainly this is one. But he was asked there repeatedly during that press conference about another, which is climbing long-end rates in the United States, hence the bigger buyback announcement of last week, the promise of some coming fiscal consolidation, which let me know if you buy into that notion. Joe, but could some of the things that the Treasury is trying to pursue, choking off Iran economically and therefore taking even more energy out of global markets, actually fuel the inflationary forces that are creating, in part, his other headache right now in terms of higher borrowing costs?
If things don't work out, yes, that would be a risk. But I was looking at the oil markets this morning, of course, and as the Secretary was speaking, and we're down almost 3%. West Texas. So there does seem to be a view that the market is taking these new actions quite seriously and that they may have some success. On the inflation side, I'm a bit more negative on inflation, just in part because the U.S. economy is booming. It's very strong. And the high productivity and the rising living standards through faster wages, which I see coming through the higher productivity, that will just take some time to play out. So I may have a little bit different view on the inflation scenario, but I understand what the Treasury Secretary is trying to do. I understand what they're talking about from a national security and global security perspective. And in that regard, I might separate the economics in the short term from longer term security and safety issues.
So you layer on this breakdown with Canada and you start to wonder, Joe, Crown Royal whiskey, goose down jackets, ice hockey equipment, confusion over cars. Does affordability just get worse?
I don't think it gets worse. I mean, the inflation data, Joe, have trended a bit lower. The core CPI is around 2.5%. That's not terrible. I think, unfortunately, perhaps the president may have been too aggressive in saying he was going to get inflation down as fast as he'd like. But the trends aren't terrible. So I don't think it's going to worsen the affordability issue. But we'll see what happens. I mean, I understand people's concerns. There's issues in terms of affordability on the mortgage side, lending side. But the reality about rates, though, is that this rise in rates has been global. And the U.S. rise in rates, Joe, has to be put in the proper perspective. It's the strongest economy among the industrialized countries. The demand for capital is high. You see it with this hundreds of billions of dollars coming to the market from the hyperscalers. Like, this is raising demand for capital because U.S. investment opportunities are so strong. And a part that is because of the president's policies of prudent business-friendly deregulation, low tax rates, low taxes on working-class Americans, so there's no tax on tips and overtime. Those are all positives that will help on the affordability side. Maybe the criticism that I level against the administration is they need to maybe message that better, because these things poll very well with everyday Americans, and maybe that's what we'll hear more of going into the midterms.
Well, the midterms are one thing. I'm curious what we'll hear more of this week, specifically from the chair of the Federal Reserve, Kevin Warsh, when he speaks at Jackson Hole, as he's going to have some of these very same issues in mind. Joe, as you talked about your view on inflation and some of the forces that are out there, the demand boom for AI infrastructure, which, yes, is obviously creating more demand for capital, but also could be inflationary in its own right. Do you think he could realistically set the stage for a hike coming soon?
Well, the Bloomberg, as you know, if you look at your Bloomberg terminal, the probability of a September hike is 40%. We've got inflation data on Wednesday. I'm upbeat on the economy, and last year, if you look at what the Fed did, they cut rates 3 times, a total of 75 basis points, to guard against unwanted weakness in the labor market. Last year, private jobs or headline jobs were only up something like 10,000 a month, and that was perhaps at the time the right thing to do. The economy, in my view, is very strong. Job growth is improving. You'd want to take back some of that emergency easing. So I could see the Fed raising rates in September. On Jackson Hole, Kevin Warsh is probably going to say we need to get inflation back to 2%. What I'd love for him to say, which I don't think he will, but if he's listening, maybe he'll put it in his speech, is he should say that the Fed funds rate is the primary instrument of monetary policy, not the balance sheet. Because one of the questions I get from a lot of clients is, what are they going to do with the balance sheet? And that is, I think, partly why longer rates may be rising, to reflect that extra term premium, given all the uncertainty. I don't think he'll say that, but I wish he would.
The president's watching. He'll tell Warsh about that, right?
Yeah.
They're talking a lot.
All of Washington's important decision makers watch and listen to this program. Joe Lavorgna, thank you for being on it. He, of course, is a former counselor to the Treasury Secretary.
Thanks,
Scott
Joe.
Bessent, now chief economist of SMBC Americas, here with us on Balance of Power, reflecting on what we just heard moments ago from Secretary Bessent as he outlined so-called economic D-Day against Iran. Here's part of what he said.
Let me be clear. Any entity that facilitates money laundering on behalf of Iran will be removed from the U.S. dollar system. The clock just started ticking.
So as our clock keeps ticking, let's turn now to our political panel. Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino are with us. Rick, of course, partner at Stonecourt Capital and Republican strategist. Jeanne, a Democratic analyst and democracy, a visiting fellow at Harvard Kennedy School's Ash Center. Welcome to you both. Rick, we've talked repeatedly since this conflict between the U.S. and Iran began about whether or not the U.S. and the president specifically is credible when making threats, because he so frequently pulls back from them, threatening to attack infrastructure, then backing off for the sake of negotiation. Should other countries who listened to the Treasury Secretary today take him more seriously in this instance, or could it also just be another bluff being called out?
Yeah, this was a little bit confusing, the statement today by Secretary Bessent. D-Day, he's been calling it D-Day for quite some time, was on June 6th. That was a day that the world remembers. I'm not sure anybody's going to remember today's press conference because it was basically a warning, not a D-Day. And so I don't know how seriously our enemies are going to take this threat, because that's who we're talking about. We're talking about people who are aligned against the interests, both economically and security-wise, against the United States. And so, sure, great to have the secretary threaten these entities and countries. Great to have the toolkit that we have as a country to be able to make an impact. But this has been going on now for over 6 months. The sanctions themselves have been going on for over 50 years. At what point are we actually going to see a result, something like a D-Day? We didn't get that today, and we didn't get a timeline to get it in the future. So I'm still scratching my head going, what in the world did we just see happen at the Treasury Department today? Certainly not a D-Day.
Wow. Do you feel the same way, Jeanne? The secretary was asked about China. No one is above the reach of U.S. sanctions, he said. If China facilitates transactions, it will be targeted. What's to be confused about?
I think the real question here is, what is the administration trying to achieve? One thing they seem to be trying to achieve is regime change. And unfortunately for all of us and the administration, economic sanctions against autocracies like Iran are very infrequently effective at regime change, because economic sanctions like this harm populations. And the thinking is the population will rise up against this regime and will overthrow it or change its ways. There has been no sort of history with Iran, and Rick mentioned the last 50 years of economic sanctions. They have weathered all of it. And now, thanks to what the administration did with starting this war in February, we have a more hardened regime in place. I don't think there's anybody who studies Iran who thinks that this regime will do anything except kill protesters without even batting an eyelash if they try to rise up now. So if it's not regime change thereafter, and there's, again, very little research evidence that that's effective, the only other alternative is we are going to badger them back to the negotiating table. That's probably our best bet, but economic sanctions of this magnitude, if they go into place, are probably just going to do what this regime wants to do, which is become more hard line, not likely to get back to the negotiating table where you had more moderates. And of course, we were at the negotiating table before the war started twice now, and we bombed them. And now we're asking them to go back to it. And when they say no, we're saying we're going to sanction them. So I'm not really feeling like this is going to be effective. The only way out of this is going to be diplomacy. And all of this is a self-inflicted wound by a president who got rid of the only negotiated settlement we had, which is the JCPOA, and then bombed them twice and has now woken up to the fact neither of those things is effective.
Well, on the subject of self-inflicted wounds, Rick, as we consider what actually might come about economically if we do see these secondary sanctions implemented, if Iran actually is choked off, if its oil is never making it on to global markets, and if this happens and Iran chooses, instead of going to the negotiating table, to retaliate against other Gulf states' energy interests throughout the region, could this actually exacerbate some of the political problems that the president is facing at home if it leads to higher energy prices, not even to say what could happen as a result of the tariffs against Canada that are now being implemented and implemented back in return?
Yeah, just focus on the Iran question. I certainly am for D-Day, and I do believe that crippling sanctions will exacerbate the domestic problems that exist in Iran. And I do believe that the only ultimate solution is not negotiation, but regime change in Iran from Iranians. So the fact that Secretary Bessent made a point of saying this is how they change governments in the Soviet Union, I think is a good indication that they're not going to the negotiating table. The question really is what you said, Kailey, is like, how tough can the administration be if it has to weather economic punishment at home because of the policies that they're now going to pursue abroad? And we haven't seen a willingness by this administration to buck the markets, to buck the bond market, to buck the increase in consumer spending. If we do see it, it's going to have a cost. I mean, the political guys in the White House, I am sure, are sitting around the same table, Bessent, saying, like, this policy could be a disaster if it's actually implemented by the midterms. And maybe that's why we didn't see a timetable, because the reality is if they'd come out today with crippling secondary sanctions on India, on China, on places who are doing business with Iran, you would probably see a negative impact on consumers, negative impact on the economy. And that's not exactly what they're looking for politically.
Jeanne, just lastly on this, is the American mindset, is the mindset of this administration one that is geared toward the long term enough to manage this? And I'll add Canada as well. One of the most read stories today in the terminal comes from Josh Wingrove, who spoke with Canadian officials all weekend to learn that they believe the trade war with the United States, which they do call it, may last well beyond the midterms, that this could in fact be a new long-term reality. Does the U.S. look at either of these instances of economic statecraft in the same way?
I'm not sure this administration does. I'm not sure the U.S. government does, but we should be. The damage in both of these instances is so long-term and so widespread. You look at what President Trump has done to our allies in just the last week, let alone in the last year, that a year and a half or two that he's been in office. You have South Korea, you have Canada, you have Oman. The list goes on and on. Now we're going to be secondarily sanctioning potentially allies for their operations with Iran. We are getting ourselves into an almost impossible position here on the world stage. And what the secretary did today was he issued an existential threat to the Iranian regime. And when you issue that kind of threat in foreign policy, that means they are going to fight to the death. And the question now for the U.S. is, are we prepared, and this gets to your long-term question, to fight to the death? Are we willing to put troops on the ground? And the answer is no, and they know it. And yes, everyone would like regime change in Iran, but we shot ourselves in the foot in February when we went in. The time to do these harsh economic sanctions and to try to support regime change in other ways was before the end of February, when people were rising up. And why they didn't do that remains an open question, but it suggests that what they want to see and what they have in mind is not long-term, but short-term wins. And that's not how Iran plays this game. And that's why we're here 50 years later.
Well, Rick, I'd like for you to weigh in on the Canada portion of this specifically, to Joe's point about Canada's expectation that this is not going to get any closer to the resolution that may be desired prior to the midterms, or maybe even not until President Trump is out of office. Characterize the strength of the U.S. and Canada's positioning in what could very much just be a tit-for-tat escalatory cycle when the Canadian Prime Minister has soaring popularity because of this trade war with the U.S., and President Trump's own approval rating has been consistently falling.
Yeah, President Trump's rating on the economy now is sub 30%. I mean, that is a historic low for a president. And as you point out, Prime Minister Carney has actually benefited both politically when he was running and since he's been in office from the challenge with Donald Trump. So when you're looking at who holds the political cards, absolutely it's the Canadians, and their fact that they are willing to put out to folks like Josh Wingrove of Bloomberg that they're going to settle in for a long fight, that they don't care about the U.S. political cycle. If anything, they're going to manipulate it to create havoc in states like Maine and Michigan and Wisconsin that have critical elections for Republicans that could determine the future of the United States Senate as far as political party control. They know what they're doing. Mark Carney's a savvy guy, and I think he's playing his set of cards that Donald Trump likes to use so much better than the current White House.
Boy, it's going to be an interesting conversation with Premier Ford tomorrow. Great panel, but this is going to be more drama than many may have bargained for. Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino, thank you both. Bloomberg Politics contributors, fascinating view from our Republican strategist and Democratic analyst. We're going to dig more into what's happening in the geopolitics with Iran on this economic D-Day, as Scott Bessent calls it, with Vali Nasr, President Middle East Studies, Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies, will be with us next here on Balance of Power. First, let's set the baseline on Wall Street. We haven't checked in with Charlie Pellet in a minute. He's got the Monday trade live from World Headquarters in New York. Charlie, what do the markets think of all this?
Right now, little change, holding right where we were just in terms of oil and gold, two of the commodities most likely to move after we heard from Scott Bessent, the U.S. Treasury Secretary. Right now, West Texas intermediate crude is down 2.5%, 84.88 a barrel. Barrel of Brent, the global benchmark, 92.10, down by 2.4%. And spot gold remains higher, up 0.8%, 46.38 for an ounce of the precious metal. U.S. equities are trading lower right now, with the Dow higher, S&P, NASDAQ, they are both declining. S&P is down 25, 76.48. That is a drop of just about 0.2%. We've got NASDAQ down 162 for the NASDAQ Composite Index, a drop there of 0.6%. Key takeaway today, we've got chip stocks being hit hard. The SOX, the Philadelphia Stock Exchange's Semiconductor Index, it is down by 2.9%. All of this ahead of NVIDIA earnings on Wednesday. Your 2-year, 4.23%. The 10-year, 4.69%. The 30-year, 5.22%. So again, gold higher, up 0.7%. West Texas intermediate crude oil down 2.5%, 84.86 a barrel. All of this as Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent announces a U.S. campaign to sever Iran from the global economy, warning that any country doing business with Iran risks facing American sanctions. Joe and Kailey, that is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie Pellet, you said it, a stark warning from the Treasury Secretary today as he said it would be economic D-Day. In the wise words of Rick Davis, it's maybe less of a D-Day, more about a warning that it could be coming, as the timeline will vary for countries here, and the Treasury does seem to be leaving some wiggle room for countries and companies who provide financial lifeline to Iran via money laundering or oil smuggling or what have you, to adjust their behavior before they fully face the force of secondary sanctions that Secretary Bessent said the Treasury is serious about enforcing if necessary.
President Trump has taken action that his predecessors have long deferred. And under his leadership, America is no longer managing the Iranian threat. We are ending it.
At least that's the plan. We tap the expertise of an expert in Vali Nasr, professor of international affairs and Middle East Studies at Johns Hopkins University. Vali, it's great to have you as part of our conversation today on Bloomberg TV and radio. It remains unclear exactly how this is going to work. The administration is giving countries some time. But if we cut to the chase here, this seems to have everything to do with China. Is the United States willing to interrupt oil trade between Iran and China if it means some pain here at home?
Well, it's not just China. The other big fish is Russia, and after that is India, it's United Arab Emirates, and it's Turkey. I mean, it's a whole host of countries that the United States needs to get very tough with. And essentially, the entire economic D-Day is not really anything new that the United States is going to do to Iran. It's things that the United States is threatening to do to its allies around the world. And that's, I think, is a very tall order for the U.S. to actually implement. And we'll see whether these countries voluntarily come along. China has already said that it will not play by the rules that the United States wants to lay down. And to me, this looks like a grandiose statement, a sort of a theatrical declaration of a major step by the United States, which may be no more effective than the president's many threats to be destroying Iran, sending it back to the Stone Age.
Well, to that point, Professor, our audience should know that you grew up in Tehran and you immigrated to the U.S. after the revolution in 1979. Iran has basically been under sanction that entire time. Since then, it's been about half a century. So why realistically would the regime bow to a tougher sanctions regime like this, assuming the U.S. does everything it says it will when it has not cowed to them in the past?
Well, Iran has been under 47 years of sanctions. I've written a book about that. And the reality is that, first of all, it has developed ways to survive under sanctions. So it's not like a country that has not previously been outside of the global economy that is all of a sudden subjected to sanctions. They build their own missiles, their own drones, their own industrial products, and they can survive under a great deal of hardship. Secondly, sanctions work really when you actually offer something on the table. That's the way it worked with President Obama. He, for the first time, introduced secondary sanctions on Iran, squeezed them hard, and then he said, here's a table we can negotiate over the nuclear program, and this is going to be a realistic diplomatic negotiation. The reality is that President Trump is offering nothing. He's basically saying, I'm going to squeeze you until you surrender, and the Iranians will not surrender. In fact, today, the Iranian Speaker of the Parliament told the visiting Pakistani military chief who went there to see if he can resolve the dilemma, that there is a pathway out of this, which means that the United States needs to go back to the MOU that it signed in June and implement the MOU. So for the Iranians, there is already a diplomatic off-ramp. And no, I think the Iranians will not give in. And they've already said that they will not tolerate any more economic pressure, that they will attack the infrastructure in the Gulf. They will put pressure on the global economy. They may shut down a lot more of the trade in oil and gas that goes over the Red Sea. Their proxies in Yemen, in Iraq will begin to put more pressure on Saudi oil facilities. And Iran may get much more aggressive in the Gulf. The U.S. has been escorting more and more tankers in the past 2 weeks, but those tankers may now come under a lot more fire than they had in the past 2 weeks. So yes, the United States can escalate, as Secretary Bessent says, but the other side also gets a vote. And the Iranians are aiming at the U.S., but the real target for them is the global economy. Whatever they do will be designed to get the attention of the energy markets, to get the attention of other dimensions of the global economy, and to make it much more difficult for the U.S. to have its cake and eat it too.
Treasury Bessent, Secretary Bessent said a major financial institution will be sanctioned this week. Vali, do you have any thoughts on who that might be?
No, I mean, we know that already all the major Western financial institutions have got out of any kind of a business with Iran. Iran is not able to use the SWIFT financial transaction mechanism, which means that even if banks wanted to deal with Iran, they don't have a regular way to deal with Iran. So that major financial institution is perhaps a Chinese institution or a Hong Kong institution connected to China. And my sense is that it potentially can invite a Chinese retaliation if the U.S. did something like that. So the U.S. is essentially expanding its war in the Gulf to a much greater war between itself and other global actors around the world, which seems to be shooting itself in the foot. It is basically expanding the geography of this war out of the Gulf into the financial markets, and it's going to get entangled with some major global actors with whom it has other business and other sets of issues that it has to deal with.
Well, the U.S., of course, says all of it, whatever comes next, is with the end goal of making sure Iran never has a nuclear weapon. Does what you're describing, Professor, bring the U.S. closer to achieving it?
That was the goal when the U.S. bombed Iran's nuclear sites in June of 2025, and President Trump declared that Iran's nuclear program was obliterated. The Iranians were negotiating exactly what he wants, namely that there would not be any Iranian nuclear weapons program or major threat to global security with Iranian nuclear program. And he decided that he would settle the whole thing militarily. He'll just go to war with Iran. They will either completely cave in or that they would basically fall from power. None of that is happening. Right. Iran has come out of this war stronger. It's been now months that the U.S. has got entangled in an endless war. President Trump has no way to finish this war diplomatically or militarily. He's stuck. And we're not even talking about Iran's nuclear program. He throws these words out there as a sort of a throwaway. In reality, the entire discussion is about the Strait of Hormuz, which was not even an issue before he went to war. We have to first resolve this issue of the Strait of Hormuz. We should have to first resolve the free flow of oil and gas out of the Persian Gulf through the Strait of Hormuz. We have to first get to a ceasefire before we can even think about Iran's nuclear program. So in a way, he's actually pushed that issue much farther out, and he's not able to resolve the steps that the United States has to get through before it can arrive back at a conversation about Iran's nuclear program.
All right, Professor, thanks for joining us. Vali Nasr, Professor of International Affairs and Middle East Studies at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. Thanks for being here on this early edition of Balance of Power. And Joe will be back for more at 5 p.m. Eastern as we recap this economic D-Day for Iran, but possibly for Canada too. Thanks for being with us on Bloomberg TV and radio.